Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We have a current events panel with us today, but we're doing a little change. Rather than having a panel, I'm actually going to be one of the panelists today. I'm going to be host and panelist. And of course, this is a regular feature here on our show. And we're going to cover many, many topics, which you probably have seen in the news headlines lately. We're going to discuss the overturn of Roe v. Wade in the U.S. and what that could mean for Canadians. We'll tackle the recent RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki scandal and talk about that. And we'll cover C-11 and how it recently passed the House of Commons and how, if it passes the Senate, this could impact you. And we'll also discuss Winnipeg's renaming of Canada Day to New Day. Lots to chat about indeed, and returning now to help me unpack it all is David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center, and of course a regular contributor here on Counterpoint. And I should add, also an occasional guest host. So welcome, David. It's good to see you, and your title keeps kind of growing here as I introduce you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So lots to chat about. Obviously, recently Roe v. Wade was overturned. That, as much as it was not surprising, because of course there was the leaked court decision in early May, so folks in America sort of had the heads up. Actually, globally, people kind of knew what to expect, but it still was surprising. It wasn't surprising, but it was still shocking, and I think it sent a shockwave through the U.S. Whether you fell on the pro-life or the pro-abortion side of the argument, it didn't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, it was shocking in the United States. It sent shockwaves throughout the international community, where you had Canadian politicians, European politicians, mostly expressing their concern because, of course, the overturn of Roe v. Wade will defer abortion access to the states, and that will really vary depending on the state. There are states, for example, like Texas, who want to put limitations as early as 10 weeks. And then there's a huge spectrum of potential laws between then and the third trimester. And so what we're seeing now is, I think, the beginning of a very prominent debate in the United States, which will continue to spill over into Canadian politics, as it often does, and as in European politics as well.
And, you know, you brought up a good point that this sort of decentralizes the abortion issue. So previously, it was kind of codified federally, and now that was overturned. There's no right to an abortion federally in the U.S. So states in their own jurisdiction, and in America, they tend to enjoy a more decentralized kind of form of government than we have sort of in recent years. We tend to be more federally focused. They tend to be more state-centric. So now the states get to decide. And you know, as we know, there have been many attempts or successful attempts to bring in restrictions to abortion access, or, you know, fetal pain bills or informed consent legislation that sort of was seen as a chipping away of abortion access or abortion rights in America. Well, there is no more abortion. There is no right to abortion in America anymore. So now the states will decide. What do you think we can expect not state to state, but in general from American states? Do you think some will just pass legislation immediately allowing what they had previously enjoyed?
I think it depends. I think in the South, you'll probably see an emergence of very restrictive bills, bills that were attempted while Roe v. Wade was upheld, that were struck down. I use Texas as the example, which is a particularly intrusive restriction. You'll probably see some traditionally blue states seek to codify legislation that is more liberal and have more access. So you'll really see a disparity on a state-by-state basis, not entirely divided red and blue, but very much so red and blue in terms of what the laws are and where women will have access to these services and at what point in pregnancy, which is really I think the biggest issue at stake is at what point does an abortion become no longer an option for somebody wanting to terminate a pregnancy?
Or at what point does the fetus, I guess, garner human rights? At what point do they receive human rights, and then that no longer is allowable? You mentioned, or just one thing to point out is a lot of these states that had previously, prior to the Roe v. Wade overturn, had passed legislation restricting access or restricting timing of abortion, those pieces of legislation were not enforceable, really, because federally there was this universal right to abortion. We're going to talk a little bit more about this and its impacts to Canada in just a few moments. David, we know the Prime Minister has spoken almost immediately on this issue, and he said that I want women in Canada to know that we will always stand up for your right to choose. Now, for some those might be welcome words, some may not. I mean, from a completely neutral perspective, we don't have a right to abortion in Canada, so I'm not exactly sure what he's referring. There is no right to abortion in Canada; it just simply doesn't exist. We have a vacuum of law. There is no law. What do you think? And we've seen that U.S. politics tends to spill over to the U.S., and they might argue that ours spill over down south as well. Think of the Freedom Convoy; it started here and it came down there. What do you think will happen, if anything, to abortion legislation? Will there be something introduced? Will this be the time to act for Prime Minister Trudeau, who has been a very known, staunch pro-choice advocate?
Well, it's interesting because I'm not sure that this is the winning issue for Trudeau as it has been in the past. And I say that because in general elections, it's been common practice for the Liberal Party to, in some senses, rightfully, point to conservative members of Parliament and their pro-life views and their views on restricting access to abortion. So it could be an opportunity for Prime Minister Trudeau to codify some sort of law enshrining access to abortion. The problem is that you'd have a huge disparity in regards to the question asked to Canadians. If you were to ask Canadians if should we change Canada's abortion laws, I think the majority of Canadians would say no, we shouldn't. But if you asked Canadians if there should be restrictions and you segmented it based on trimester, you would see a majority of Canadians be in support of restrictions in the later trimesters, especially the third trimester. So you would most likely end up getting legislation that would be more restrictive than abortion access is today. And I think it would largely be it would eat up a lot of the political conversation if we were to go down the route of, let's say, a ban of abortion in the third trimester, of legislating something that is so incredibly rare. It begs the question of why legislation is even needed.
Sorry, then what is incredibly rare?
A third trimester abortion. It's less than 1.5% of all abortions in Canada, and that doesn't include. That does not include those which are required due to some sort of maternal health issue or non-viable issue with the fetus. And so we're talking about something that is so incredibly rare in terms of abortion in Canada, something that has declined significantly over the last 10 years. I believe it's down by as much as 20,000 since 2007. Down 30,000 since 2015. So it's something that is declining, and that third trimester question is so incredibly rare. It really just makes you wonder why that would be what should dominate the political discussion here in Canada. Because
and just for people to know, our viewers should know that we mentioned there is no law on abortion, so there is no restriction at any time up until the moment of birth, I suppose, even partial birth. You can have an abortion in Canada. You're right; they're not as common at that point, but you can. There is access. There is no criminality to that. You will not be prosecuted.
Yeah, but I think you also have to factor in that for that decision to be made, there is a huge of that 1.29%. A significant portion of those would be due to things like infection, hemorrhage, and other health problems that make it, in many instances, a requirement, not an elective procedure as commonly explained when predominantly people on the pro-life side talk about abortion happening in the third trimester. And so that 1.29% is actually much lower once you factor in instances where it's medically necessary to do so.
And sorry, where did you get that 1.29%? Because I've never heard that stat.
So that is from the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, published on March 28th, 2022. So this is the most up-to-date data we have in terms of the figures in Canada. And I think that regardless of where you stand, the fact that the demand for abortion has gone down significantly is a good thing. Whether you're pro-life or you're pro-choice, that is a good thing. That means that on the pro-choice side, less women feel that they need to do so. On the pro-life side, it means that fewer abortions are taking place. And the fact that the third trimester figure is so low suggests that there are not a lot of people making that decision.
Welcome back. We're covering current events here with David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center, and of course, a frequent guest here on our program. We're just going to wrap up the Roe v. Wade. I have one kind of comment to sum it up with. You know, if Canada were to go down the path of bringing in legislation to, at this point, it would be restrict abortion because we have abortion on demand in Canada. You know, I find it interesting because, you know, globally it seems that we cannot decide or cannot come to a consensus on what is a woman, but yet here we are dealing with women's issues. And I find it, I'm not trying to make light of it, I just find it interesting, an interesting observation that, you know, we would legislate one thing, but yet we can't even come to a consensus on what is a woman. Let's pivot now. There was a recent scandal brew, I suppose you could say, with respect to RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, and as it pertains to that mass shooting, that horrible, horrible mass shooting, I guess 2 years ago now in Nova Scotia. Share with us what happened there, David.
Yeah, from what we're seeing now with the release of new notes, it looks as though there may have been political interference on the part of the Prime Minister's office and the Justice Minister in regards to seeking information and trying to get that to justify potential firearms legislation. And that's concerning. I mean, it's concerning for two reasons. One, law enforcement is supposed to be its own entity and operate without interference from politicians. But it's also concerning because it appears to be part of a trend. It's not long ago with the SNC scandal where you had the PMO's office aggressively intervening and shuffling cabinet to essentially push for a deferred prosecution agreement. And so it appears as though, although we don't have all of the details, it appears as though we have the Prime Minister's office rather nefariously taking what is a horrific mass shooting and trying to essentially see what they can gain from it politically.
Right.
And so it's problematic from the prospect of interference, but I think beyond that, it's problematic when you look at it as, I mean, the last thing that should come to your mind if you're in the Prime Minister's office after a mass shooting like this is how can we use this for political gain?
Right.
And it's not 100% clear that is what has happened, but it's very hard to give the government the benefit of the doubt given their track record of denying, deferring, placing the blame on other people, and then ultimately having to come to grips with the reality that what was originally alleged actually did happen.
Right. You said that there has been a bad track record, which is unfortunate, but people make their own political beds and then they have to lie in them. And we know what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould, and when she testified, we know what the allegations were at that hearing. You know, there's some horrific things that happened. This obviously was a truly horrific event, this mass shooting. You know, this one man going on a rampage like that, it was atrocious. And I remember, because we were just, I guess, near the tail end of the first lockdown, because this was, I believe, May 2020 or April 2020, and we were all concerned about COVID and this lockdown, and, you know, I think we were in week 6 at this point. And then the shooting occurs, and it seemed to me at lightning speed, this legislation for firearms restriction was introduced. And I thought, wow, that was really quick. And again, the allegation here, because these are just allegations, is that, as you said, the Prime Minister's office conferred with Brenda Luckie and said we wanted to have the names of the guns released so that way it can help us as we, I'm paraphrasing here, but as we put forward legislation for gun control.
Yeah, and it begs the question of how many times will Canadians fall for the story in the Globe and Mail was false? Because it's happened so many times. And obviously the PMO's office, the PMO is saying that they did not commit any undue interference. The notes that were released suggest otherwise. And so here we are again, seeing at the discretion of the Prime Minister, the government wade into territory which is traditionally against the norms of our politics in terms of independence of whether it be the judicial system or law and order. And I mean, that's problematic. And beyond it being a trend, it also demonstrates, if what is alleged is true, that not much is being learned from this consistent pattern of making these mistakes.
Well, I think this will be flushed out because apparently MPs voted now to have Brenda Luckie come in front of a commission. So we'll have to see. We got to cut to commercial break and we'll be right back. So David, this C11, which was previously C10, but then of course we had the federal election, so it got renamed, is that called like the CRTC Internet Censorship Bill, whatever you want to call it, online streaming Canadian content bill. It has now passed through the House of Commons towards the end a little bit abruptly, and it's now in the Senate. Now, the Senate has said that they are not going to be rushing through with this, that they want to really take their time and evaluate it, which I appreciate because this has far-reaching consequences or ramifications. So I think it's important that some body of our government takes its time with really going with a fine-tooth comb to see what is going on here. So, we recently heard from Peter Menzies, a former vice chair for the CRTC. This bill could really regulate, again, Canadian content. It has the ability to change what you see online on online streaming services. Already that is being managed with broadcast services, your cable companies, but now with Netflix or even with YouTube, you know how you have that little side panel that says, oh, we suggest this video for you. You always wonder, how do they know what I want to see? Well, if you're a gardening fanatic, then they'll probably recommend a lot of gardening things. Unless C11 passes, and maybe those gardening DIY videos are really they don't have that much Canadian content, or maybe someone decides you shouldn't be seeing that. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's problematic from a consumer standpoint because it's entirely unnecessary. We already have an entity that creates Canadian content. It's called the CBC. They make a lot of content. We spend a lot of money on creating Canadian content through the CBC. And regardless of what you think of the CBC, that is one of the roles it plays. I'm not really sure if Canadian consumers are served well by being told they need to see at least X% Canadian content on Netflix or YouTube. Because we know they don't necessarily want it, and we know that they don't necessarily want it because they're not demanding it now. If the law would be moot if Canadians were seeking out Canadian content at the percentage the government deems necessary, we would know they were doing that because that's what Netflix or YouTube's algorithm or what have you would generate for them in terms of driving views. There's also a huge issue here on the creator side, where it now limits the ability for content creators what they need to include. It just seems like a really unnecessary intrusion into how consumers experience streaming and the internet, and it's just going to drive a lot of bad funding to content that people probably won't watch. If Netflix all of a sudden has to have a certain percentage of Canadian content, it's probably going to do the bare minimum. The content is not going to be particularly good. I'd much rather watch Game of Thrones or House of Cards or all the other very popular shows that make Netflix what it is. And so I really don't think we're served by that. It just puts undue burden onto YouTube, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, etc., in a way in which is telling Canadians that they have to watch Canadian content, and that feels that makes me very uncomfortable in terms of altering algorithms to ensure that.
Yeah, it seems absurd to me, and I think you point out well that probably the biggest loser in this will be the consumer. It will be the consumer. Speaking of Canadian content, there seems to be a canceling of Canadian content in Winnipeg. The local city of Winnipeg is deciding to change Canada Day and celebrate New Day instead. We only have 45 seconds left, but this seems absurd to me.
It's embarrassing. I understand why, given the context of the political discussions that have happened, especially with Indigenous peoples over the last 2 years, let's say, why it may be a little bit more of a sober moment. But that doesn't mean that this country doesn't have so much to celebrate. I mean, it's one of the freest countries, both socially and economically, in the world. That is something worth celebrating. Whether you're a progressive or you're a conservative, it has protected in many instances the things that both sides cherish. And so it feels very strange to me to try and cancel Canada Day when there's so much to be proud of, regardless of what your political perspective is. And celebrating Canada Day does not invalidate any of the historic injustices that our federal government or provincial governments have committed. Certainly reflect on that. But the idea to cancel Canada Day as a solution to that feels more like empty symbolism than actually doing anything to address those problems.
Well, let's hope that that idea will soon be canceled and then we can celebrate it in true fashion. David Clement, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.